Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Julie and I will be your instructor for this course. So today we're going to be talking about the history and modern significance of opinion journalism. So we just want to dive into the basics before we talk about things like rhetoric and strategic uses of rhetorical devices in opinion journalism. So okay, first, I just want to get to know y'all a little bit better and the kind of work that y'all are interested in. So if y'all could type in the chat one topic that you're excited to write and or learn more about during this course of the class, that'd be great. So just type in the chat one thing that, cats, that's cute. Everything you don't know. Sexism, yeah, that's a really great topic to talk about because it's super broad and definitely an issue that we need to tackle. Political issues, yep, it's very valid. Yeah, coronavirus. There are a plethora of things you can talk about concerning coronavirus, things like homelessness, as well as rushing a vaccine. Okay. Someone said social issues such as racism and sexism. Again, great to use opinion journalism when talking about these things. It conveys them in a very coherent manner. So as y'all are sending more topics into the chat, I'll just go in to the next slide. So this is what the course description on Alphademic is. Just as a refresher, opinion journalism is a way to express judgment and fuel public deliberation on salient things in the world full of strong takes. Ranging from op-eds to newspaper columns, it is fused with words of voice, advocacy, and story, all of which support a greater concept of truth. This course covers the history, ethics, and societal importance of opinion journalism with a focus on editorial writing. Students will explore the writing techniques and rhetorical devices commonly employed in effective opinion pieces, enhance their research skills, master their thesis writing abilities, and strengthen the presence of their voice in their writing. Ultimately, they will learn how to better articulate their thoughts along their writing journey. With the individualized feedback and multiple writing exercises that this course has to offer, students will be able to craft their own opinion pieces on topics they are passionate about with depth, concision, and spirit. So before we talk about how we can make great opinion pieces, we should talk about the history of it. I think learning the history of opinion journalism and its effects on modern culture can be great in understanding what purpose it serves and how you want to fuse your own individual purpose, your political positions, and your advocacy in your writing. So for brief history, we'll start with before the early 19th century. This is like the 1700s and early 1800s. Newspapers were often partisan, and the worlds of opinion journalism and news reporting were often intertwined. So what this means is that newspapers did not focus on having objective truths in their writing. They didn't report on social issues that were happening as they were occurring, but rather having people speak on those issues was a norm. It wasn't anything to be questioned. It wasn't something to be called out on, and it certainly wasn't something that was segregated. So for example, starting in 1789, Alexander Hamilton funded the Federalist paper, the Gazette of the United States. I'm not sure how many of y'all were in the US history class that was led over the summer, but the Federalist Party was one of the first political parties in America, and it certainly did have a lot of political tensions with other parties that were forming in the same time period. And Alexander Hamilton was a great influence on that as well. He certainly did lead it. And so next is in 1801, Alexander Hamilton himself created the New York Post, and that served as a platform for the Federalist Party to express their political views, which usually meant opposing Thomas Jefferson. And once again, this wasn't something to be thought of as absurd, as a violation of the rights to journalism, and certainly, it was an endorsement of their freedom of speech. And the last point is that newspapers were actually subsidized by political parties. So what this means is that political parties had their own newspapers that would be circulated in their specific political party. Their supporters would read them, buy them, and that's how they got their money. They circulated these opinions, and they often wouldn't be exposed to opinions of other people because their political parties, their respective political parties would fuse their own opinions in those writings only. So next we'll focus on the turning point to that. So in the 1830s, a man by the name Benjamin Henry Day, that's what he looks like, by the way, he's on the right. He was a medical student. He realized that people were more likely to purchase cheap newspapers as opposed to expensive ones because obviously they would want to save money. And that producing a cost-efficient newspaper, i.e. making cheap newspapers, not that great of quality, not that great of writers maybe, that would pay less, could generate profits if he charged for advertisements. So in that way, he charged advertisers more for a spot on the front page. And that's how advertisement and publishment started getting intertwined through things like sponsorships that we know of today. And they produced Day's New York Sun, which is also a publication, and it was the first penny newspaper. And as the name denotes, it was just a very cheap newspaper. They were cost efficient, they didn't cost much, and more importantly, the publication was profiting from it, and it was incredibly successful. And we know that it's successful because of his contributions to journalism and how that changed it. So newspaper companies were focused on making money amidst a wave of newspapers mergers and closings. In the early 1800s, a bunch of newspapers were merging and closing. It wasn't a great business. The economy was not doing that great, hence the political tensions. So newspapers wanted to save as much money as possible. So they figured out they could make more money by broadening the appeal to their audiences. This meant not focusing on a partisan approach, but rather bipartisan. They wanted to appeal to voters and average citizens who did not agree with their views traditionally. This meant not focusing on any particular viewpoint, as I said, and also getting rid of partisan rants. So the thing is, prior to this model of making money and generating profit from newspapers, opinion writing was the norm in journalism and newspapers. And this meant that it either took forms in just politicians ranting about social issues, political issues, and even public figures, or they would write anonymous letters. And that obviously decreased in popularity, and not many people like to read that anymore because they were getting the same kind of information. It wasn't thought stimulating. So what's important to note is that upholding a model of bipartisan reporting is best described as a business decision. Essentially, at the end of the day, newspapers did not change the way they reported, i.e. reporting by objective news as opposed to partisan opinion, because they were in search of some sort of truth or because they had some sort of public backlash. It was all for profit. There was no ethical reason behind changing that model of publication, which is the important thing to know, because that will implicate how we view journalism in the modern day. So next, how did opinions return? So Horace Greeley, he's the man you see on the left. In 1841, he founded the New York Tribune. And he is credited with the idea of separating opinions and news in newspapers and for inventing the editorial. But we're going to focus on how he segregated the newspaper. Now, when you see newspapers, whether it be physical or online, there are always separate headings. You see a news heading, you see an opinions, you see features, and etc. And Greeley labeled the section that he separated the editorial page, which is more commonly labeled as opinion by other newspapers now. Either way, it was a start of segregating newspapers and labeling the type of journalism that they would fall under, which is drastically different from earlier models of journalism, because earlier models of journalism would just put everything on the same page, and if it didn't generate money, then they would get rid of it. Okay, so the legacy of Greeley. So I mentioned that he created the Editorial. It's a column written to reveal the newspaper's institutional opinion. And what was really unique about the Editorial is that it gave a lot of leeway for personality, to show common beliefs. So this allowed family-owned papers to build long-term relationships with the community, which also is a huge turning point to the way journalism and newspapers had functioned before, because newspapers had always tried to appeal to people who were already in the same kind of community with them. They had the same beliefs and they read the same things because of that reason. And family-owned papers that built long-term relationships with communities, they were more focused on having a more authentic appeal to micropolitics. So the next point is, by the early 1900s, many writers were given designated spaces in the paper to share their opinions with the public. So this is actually another form of opinion writing that we'll talk about later, and I won't get too much into the history behind how different forms of opinion writing was discovered. And I do talk about Horace Greeley because he's one of the most credited because of the segregation of the newspaper. But yeah, so people were tuning into newspapers because they wanted to see certain writers write. And in the 1920s, Franklin P. Adams of the New York Tribune jump-started the rise of newspaper columns, which is exactly what that is. So what is opinion journalism? Simply put, it's journalism that makes no claim of objectivity. And we'll explore what that objectivity means later on. But first, we should familiarize ourselves with the forms of opinion journalism. So the first one is a column. We've talked about this just now. It's a recurring piece or article where a writer expresses their own individual opinion. This is a very personalized opinion. It's not the opinion of the publication. It's very much about what the writer thinks, and people read it to know what the writer themselves think. And next is the editorial, which we've already talked about. It's a column that reveals the newspaper's institutional opinions on issues that the editorial board decides are important for readers to know their stance on. So what happens is that a group of editors will decide that a topic in the status quo in the current political realm is important to talk about, and that readers should know that they have a stand. We'll see later on that many people argue this is an unethical way of conflating newspapers, their goal of reaching truth and enlightenment in society with their own personal opinion and biases. But I think personally, the editorial is a way to separate that. This is what our course is going to focus on, editorial writing. It's more of like the most common form of traditional writing that takes place in kind of an essay format. And next is the op-ed, which is short for opposite the editorial page. It's a prose-style piece written by an article by an author, usually not affiliated with the publication. We won't focus on this too much, but we will look at some examples later on of the op-ed. It definitely is a interesting way of writing in opinion journalism, just because of how it's prose style and not necessarily, you know, the traditional essay format that most people publish in newspapers. Yeah. So next after that is the editorial cartoon. These are political cartoons, but there are more outside of political cartoons that editorial cartoons encompass, but political cartoons are the most common ones. They are graphics that express the artist's opinions, and they're usually done with caricatures of public figures using satire and hyperbole. I'm sure y'all have seen these in your classes. Maybe a lot of history classes will use them to show the zeitgeist of a political challenge or a time period in history. And after that is punditry. It's commentary given to mass media by anyone who is or can appear knowledgeable about a certain topic. So I think the best way to explain this is there's some kind of social media presence. They use mass media, not necessarily publications, but your average things like Instagram, like Snapchat and Twitter. I think especially on Twitter, you often see newspapers like the New York Times even referencing tweets from a self-proclaimed doctor, or they can't actually be a doctor on Twitter, giving out advice to, I don't know, say Trump on handling the coronavirus. These are valid forms of opinion journalism, and it's really interesting because it's kind of a new phenomenon. It's relatively new to the 21st century just because of how mass media has kind of facilitated opinion journalism forms. And now anyone can be an opinion journalist. You don't necessarily have to find a publication, but just tweet something out, and that also counts. Yeah. So I've listed 5 forms of opinion journalism here, but obviously there are more. As I said, mass media has made everything opinion journalism open a lot of space for creativity that doesn't confine them to the 5 structures that I've listed here. So next I want to talk about reporting objectivity, because if you refer to a definition, journalism makes no claim to objectivity. This is kind of a recent phenomenon. So we live in an era of mass information, defined not only by the acceleration of news stories and commentary, but also a unique medium, the internet. So as journalism moves online, publications can increase output, which simultaneously overwhelms readers unable to tell the difference between news and opinion stories, which are both displayed graphically at the same level. So this article that I have over here is really interesting. Here, I'll just type it in and show you all what it is. So it's an article by The Conversation, and the title is "Journalists Believe News and Opinions Are Separate, but Readers Cannot Tell the Difference." And it highlights a New York Times article that opinion editor James Bennett published of U.S. Senator Tom Cotton. It was a very controversial piece. It's called "Tom Cotton, Send in the Troops." And the site is "The nation must restore order, the military stands ready." And as you can imagine, it was very controversial because this was published around the spike in Black Lives Matter protests and the spike in media coverage on police brutality. So the public was very much outraged, and actually the staff of the New York Times uprised against Bennett, which forced him to resign from being the opinions editor. It got a lot of criticism because they felt like they were conflating authentic news telling to a very controversial opinion like sending in the military to put down protests with force. It's a very unfortunate thing, but opinion journalism kind of exposes how that happens. So I want to ask you all, why can this be considered a bad sign for opinion journalism? And why do you think people are concerned that we may be conflating news and opinions, even if they are under separate headings on things like the New York Times? They are both represented on the same graphic level. So they both have a picture on the side and a bold heading. People can't really tell the difference. But why is that considered bad? Feel free to type in the chat or unmute yourself. Oh, okay. So I'm looking at the chat now. Someone asked me how to structure the writing. We will get into that in a later lesson. We will break down exactly what goes into an opinion piece. You'll actually read an example today, but I will definitely help you work with one. We'll talk about rhetorical strategies that make an opinion piece more effective. Also, how to open it with a engaging introduction and a meaningful conclusion. Someone asked, what are caricatures? Caricatures are just very like exaggerated images of people. Journalists often do it in a mocking way. Here, I'm gonna search up for you Trump caricature. I think, hold on. I think there's a better example for, all right, here we go. So these are very exaggerated images, as you can tell. We can see that his hair is very flat. People often compare it to a bird. His legs are shorter. He looks silly, which kind of mocks him as someone that's not serious, not to be taken seriously. I'll give you an example of an editorial cartoon. So yeah, these are editorial cartoons. And this one is a caricature. This uses like a hyperbole almost. And satire plays on irony in very humorous but also subtle ways, I would say. Let me just go back to the chat. Someone asked, can I post the slides? I will post the slides after this class. I'll post it on Google Classroom. Someone asked, what does simultaneously mean? Simultaneously is when something happens at the same time. So I can say, I was eating a biscuit while simultaneously juggling 2 balls. So simultaneously just is an adverb that describes things happening at the same time. Katie said, they will likely become prejudiced against something that is true due to an opinion piece. Yeah, definitely. I think opinion journalism very much strives to articulate that opinion in the most convincing way. And when people believe that the opinion journalism piece is true, you know that they've done it effectively. But as Katie pointed out, it's not supposed to be at a level of truth, but rather a level of questioning. It's questioning towards the truth, which is the actual news. I think when you talk about things like fake news, which was a very big phenomenon and social media kind of endemic during the elections in 2017 on Facebook, especially, like with mass media proliferating fake news, people were not sure what the news actually was, because although the fake news did not take form in the traditional opinion journalism, like through editorials, they very much took place in biases that pretended to be news, pretend to be actual news, but they were actually fake, which can be a very problematic thing. So I think our discussion of objectivity very much goes into the ethics of opinion journalism. It's a whole discussion on fake news, on overreach of public perception, when is public voice too much. So I will post these articles onto Google Classroom at the end of this Zoom session. I encourage y'all to check it out. I actually am going to post an assignment just for y'all to read one of these articles. You don't have to read both. They're both extremely great reads, and I highly recommend them because they're very thought-provoking. And I just want to know what y'all think of them. So the first one is an Economist article on how objectivity in journalism became a matter of opinion. This article was really interesting because it kind of proved how far opinion journalism has gotten, where the discussion of opinion journalism takes the form of opinion journalism in the first place. Like, debate takes place in this scheme of language and newspaper publications that they are accusing. The second one is a Time article on the journalistic objectivity evolved the way it did for a reason. This article basically tracks the way that objectivity has been a kind of a public scandal in American culture from all the way from the early 1900s. So if you recall back, we actually went up to the 1920s in our brief history when the column was created. But this Time article goes from the 1920s onwards in pretty specific ways that I don't think we have time to get to in one class. They point out specific ways in American culture, like McCarthyism, where opinion journalism was utilized to shape public perception. And it's a very interesting read, so I highly recommend that you read either one of these. Okay, so the last thing we'll do today is look at an example of an editorial, because we went over the history, we went over how it has evolved in modern day with mass media. And next class, we'll look at ethics as well as start to structure our writing. But I think it would be beneficial to look at this editorial that my school newspaper produced, actually. So while we look at this editorial, y'all should think about these following questions. Why did the editorial board find it necessary to speak out on this topic? And how has the editors infused both factual information and individual perspectives in the piece? So just some backstory. So the Stuyvesant Spectator is my school newspaper. And as you can see, it was written by the editorial board. It was written in June 14, 2020. So what it tells you is this was at the spike of the Black Lives Matter movement. The death of George Floyd, as well as Breonna Taylor. Protests were going on a daily basis at this point, as well as police brutality. Oh, someone raised their hand. Yeah, Sophie, go ahead. You can speak.
Okay, sorry. There's just this thing on your screen, and like there's this drawing. I don't know where it was from, and I couldn't see the words.
Oh. Okay, are you talking about the editorial cartoon?
No, I think that's annotations. I think it's annotations.
I think there's a button in the more section where you can disable annotations.
Wait, are you talking about the editorial cartoon?
No, it's on Zoom. You can annotate on the screen.
Oh, okay, I see. Okay. Yeah, I can see y'all drawing on the screen. Okay. Thanks for letting me know, by the way. Thank you. Okay. So yeah, it's written by the editorial board in June 14th, as I contextualize that. It was it was a month of a lot of racial tensions. And this was written as part of our last issue. So this is titled, "It's Time to Talk About Asian Black Tensions." And yeah, would anyone like to read this first paragraph? Yeah, Sophie, go ahead.
Sorry. The recent circumstances surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement have brought to light the racism entrenched in American society. Not only that, but Asian American police officer Hal Bow's complicity in the murder of George Floyd, as he defended fellow officer Derek Chauvin from passerby who attempted to intervene, also indicates the Black-Asian tension lurking underneath the traditional racial narrative between whites and minorities. This relationship is apparent within the Stuyvesant community, with African Americans and Asian Americans sitting on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of representation in the student population. Across all New York City schools, Black students make up 25% of the student population, though they only make up less than 1% as how do you say that word?
It's pronounced Stuyvesant.
Stuyvesant?
Yep.
Okay. Stuyvesant. This disparity not only directly impacts student culture and life at Stuyvesant, but also reflects larger systems and events at play and thus merits the intervention of students, administration, and families to understand and engineer a solution to the issue. That's the first paragraph.
Thank you, Sophie. So immediately in this first paragraph, we get a sense of voice and collectivity. So this first paragraph, it starts off with contextualizing the purpose of the article. And it starts that immediately with describing recent events that the editorial board may have talked about. They may have wanted, what motivated them to think about writing something together as the editorial board. Because many times articles submitted by writers to the editorial board to edit, editorial boards don't really get a say in the opinion that it produces, but the editorial board represents the entire publication. So what this paragraph says is, at the end, it says, this disparity not only directly impacts student culture and life at Stuyvesant, but also reflects larger systems and events at play. And then they talk about how it merits the intervention of students, administration, and families to understand and engineer a solution to the issue. So immediately what this paragraph does in this piece is call out students, administrations, and families. They're not talking about readers specifically, but they wanted to make a claim to engage their community, their specific community, which is the Stuyvesant community, the school. So administration specifically is also an indicator of why the editorial board wrote this article. And if you look back on one of the questions, the second one was, how has the editors infused both factual information and individual perspective in the piece? And I think this first paragraph does a really great job in setting that up, because not only does it give a statistic, which is the 25% of the student body referring to Black students, they use that statistic to further a engagement of diversity and diversifying the school, which is great. So after that, they move on to a history of racial tensions between Asian and Black communities. And they specifically talk about the police officer's Bao's involvement in the murder of George Floyd. Before I go on, does anyone know is anyone clear on who George Floyd is? Or is anyone not clear on that? Okay, that's good. Okay. Yeah, so they contextualize a bunch of movements that have been going on in terms of history and in modern day involving Thao's complicity in the murder. And then they go on to write about racial tensions at a micro level, which is where the opinion kind of manifests. They do an analysis, a critical race analysis of how Asian students, their cultural environments at home may have bred racial complicity to racial stereotypes, as well as systems of racism. But I think that this paragraph right here is kind of the turning point in where the editorial board kind of takes a step back from describing recent events to putting their foot down and saying that they actually have a stance on this and that the Spectator as a whole, the newspaper, won't stand for it. Someone asked, is there a break? There isn't a break today, but I'll let you all go about like 5 to 10 minutes early if we finish through all of this first. Okay. I think we can read this last paragraph now. Does anyone want to read this last paragraph? Cece?
Ultimately, the onus for the creation of safer spaces for Black and Hispanic students rests on the vast majority of the student body that is not Black or Hispanic. On top of educating ourselves on the extensive and untaught history of Asian-Black tensions in America, raising conversations with family members about race will begin dismantling preconceived and well-established biases against Blacks at home. Upon our return to Stuyvesant, actively confronting racist comments and actions of other students will be crucial to overcoming the culture of complicity among the Asian student body. Participating in conversations regarding race, whether in talk circles around race, between family and friends, or with those who both share and oppose our own viewpoints, could be the start of major and long overdue change within Stuyvesant's racial divide.
Thank you. Okay. So after we read the introductory paragraph and the conclusion, I think you get a sense of what the Spectator editorial board is trying to say. What I think makes this piece really unique is how it doesn't take an outright stance. It doesn't say specifically like testing strategies in Stuyvesant or in the school are bad. They analyze how testing operates in reference to Black and Hispanic students. Maybe they won't get as much resources to test prep as other more privileged groups would get, which I think says a lot about how an opinion piece, it says a lot about how versatile opinion journalism is, because an opinion piece doesn't necessarily have to take a stance on something in the most outright way, but it still takes a stance on something in the sense that it comments on a social structure. What you get here is a proclamation from the editorial board that they are against racism that goes on in school. They are for the Black Lives Matters movement, and they are against any form of systemic racism that manifests in like racial stereotypes. And oftentimes, I think is really interesting is how journalists will include ways to navigate those issues. For example, as SEC read, the editorial board gives suggestions to talk with family and friends, and talks about talk circles around race is just a program that lets students talk openly about their experiences with racism. Although they don't say outright that the Stevenson Spectator, the newspaper, won't condone this, they do suggest ways to fix it. And it's a very subtle way of injecting opinion into a modern form of news telling. So yeah, I just wanted to show y'all this example so y'all can get just familiarity with seeing what editorials look like. As you can see, it's very subtle and it does connect with the community. Yeah. So next week, we'll talk about ethics regarding objectivity, as well as how to start structuring our writing and how we can implement those into our writing. Hold on. Does anyone have any questions for today? I like the faces in the chat. Yeah. Since we didn't take a break or anything, I'm going to let y'all go early. But before we go, does anyone have any questions? Okay. If there are no questions, oh, wait. Okay. If there are no questions, I'm gonna let y'all go. Just remember to check the Google Classroom because I will be posting these 2 articles as well as a little response bubble for y'all to tell me what your thoughts were on it. It doesn't have to be much. You don't have to write a full out response just yet or an opinion piece just yet. We'll do that later, but I just want to know what your thoughts are on these 2 pieces, which are both opinion pieces, by the way. Someone asked, what is, hold on. Oh, okay. So someone asked, what is resentment? I think it's best to describe resentment as like a bitter feeling for feeling like they've been treated unfairly in the past. I think the most effective synonym to resentment would be bitterness, or also indignation. But I think bitterness and resentment kind of go hand in hand. So that's what resentment means. In the context of the article that I just showed you, resentment, the editorial board described Asian Americans like resentment against Black students because, again, these are issues that you can talk about in your own writing pieces, but when it comes to things like affirmative action, I'm not sure how many of y'all know what that is, but you can definitely do more research on it when you choose a topic to write on. Affirmative action. So they think, a lot of Asian students think that their spots at big universities and colleges are being taken away because colleges want to diversify and include more Black and Hispanic students in their school. Yeah, so that's what that means. Are there any more questions? Oh, okay, so someone asked, what does preconceived mean? Preconceived is described an idea that is formed without having any evidence before it or truth. So you can have a preconceived notion that someone is a mean person without having even met them. It's preconceived because you don't even know if it's true yet, and you have no evidence that they're a mean person. Okay. If there are no more questions, I'm going to stop the recording and dismiss y'all.